Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate it. I do want to emphasize that everything that is delivered this afternoon, we will go through next week when we're together in DC, and the presentation will also be posted in the members room on our website once this is completed. So you'll have ample opportunities to refresh your memories. So with that, let me just turn it over to our McBee team, and they will walk you through our priorities for 2016, as well as why we are doing this.
Hi, everyone. We're excited to have you all come into town next week. We, as Terry explained, wanted to give a presentation, a little bit of a lobbying 101, as well as an issue update and briefing before we go meet with the offices of our members of Congress and key committees. So first off, let me present the agenda for today. As I mentioned, Lobbying 101, we'll do a quick discussion of the upcoming elections, the state of Congress, USTOA's priorities, our key asks, and then we'll wrap up and take questions.
In terms of the first item on lobbying 101 and the goals and what we're going to do, I mean, your visits to Capitol Hill, as many of you that have done this before, are very important as you sort of disseminate the message of USTOA and its importance. And also it helps you, what we call offensively and defensively in terms of legislation and regulatory issues. And the way that we do this is, and this is where you come in terms of the front line, is you drive home the value of your industry, what you do, your company, to the folks and the key decision makers and staff that you're going to be meeting with. Next slide. And obviously the reasons that we do this is, you know, USTOA has priorities, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it really is to talk about those things, talk about the environment that we're dealing with. You know, we talk about funding for different issues, how difficult it is to get funding, but also how important it is to you and to your customers and consumers. But it is important that we drive that message home, because, you know, there are a lot of people on the Hill doing that, but not necessarily in our sector, and the importance that you have to the economy and to all of these communities is really important. You guys, you know, can constantly hit on the theme of the importance of travel and tourism, what it means to the local communities as well. Next slide. In terms of why we're engaging and why you're doing this, one of the things that they have always said about Washington and politics is that everything is local. The more we can connect, you know, if you're from Boston and you're talking to the members from Boston, that makes a difference. But all of you have footprints across the country in terms of your consumers and the folks that you reach out to, and that's also important. It's also important that many of you are offering, you know, tours and the like to the states and member offices that we're going to be visiting. So those are all important elements of the business that you do and the relationships that you can build with these folks. Those relationships will be with key thought leaders, whether they're committee chairmen, caucus co-chairs, and members on travel and tourism throughout. So a couple of key points to remember as you go through this. It is nothing is sort of like going to an appointed hour for the doctor's appointment. Everything changes and can change on a dime, whether it's because of a vote, lack of space, a member isn't able to do it, they get called away. Be prepared and be flexible. As members have votes or whatever it is, you may do meetings standing up in the hall, you may do them in the cafeteria over a cup of coffee, you may do them in an office. All of those things will happen. As you talk to people, though, what's also important is remember the things that they have asked you for. Keep track of those things, and then we can follow up and get them that information. And we will backfill all of that information after you leave with those various offices. It's also important to be concise. Each meeting is slated for 30 minutes. You don't want to be late for the next meeting. In that 30 minutes, we've got a lot to get done. You've got to do your introductions, and everybody should have an opportunity in those meetings to do introductions. We have seen situations where the person that's leading starts to talk, and then they, not that any of your members have done this at USTOA, but they forget to then introduce everybody. Then there's sort of an awkward pause, and you've got to go back and do it. Try and get that done in the beginning so the people in the room understand, the staffers or the members understand where you're from, what you do, but keep those things concise. You will find at times, one member may say something, and that may trigger one of the USTOA participants may say something, and that may trigger a reaction from a member or a staff who will then engage them, but then keep going on with the rest of the introductions. In terms of the team roles, you've got team leaders, and that each team will figure out that process. You'll each, at least what I have seen over the years is over time, people end up having different roles and want to discuss different issues and are more comfortable with certain things than others. And then sometimes somebody will have a better tie to an office or to a constituency situation. So use the strengths that you've got. Make sure that as best you can, everybody has the ability to participate and is able to outline, the priorities for USTOA. And as I mentioned before, make sure you track the follow-up items, and we'll get on those as well. Next. Highlights.
Sam, I think I'll jump in here and just talk about some of the things that I like to highlight when I'm on the Hill with Paula and Peter and whoever. So clearly, we're a 44-year-old association, and that's always good to remind folks of, as well as we're a $13.5 billion industry. We should always note that number is provided to us through our PricewaterhouseCoopers relationship. We currently have 51 active members, and they represent over 160 different brands, and we have approximately 700 associate members. And as we all know, this day and age, it's all about jobs and job creation. So when we talk about jobs, we always package it that active and associate members of USTOA employ over 450,000 U.S. citizens. And then if it's appropriate at some point in the conversation to include our $1 million Travelers Assistance Program, which all of our active members are required to participate in. It's all about consumer protection. And certainly with the Democrat offices, anything consumer focused resonates. So if you can somehow put that into the conversation at the appropriate time, it's a good thing to highlight as well. And that's unique to USTOA. No other association in the U.S. has a program similar to that. Next slide.
Hi everyone, so now that we've done a little bit of the Lobbying 101, we want to give you kind of the state of affairs in Washington, D.C. As you know, the upcoming elections are coming up, which will potentially impact everything around here as well as across the country. For example, the Senate, as you know, it's very closely split right now, but the Republicans now control the Senate. This upcoming election has a lot of Republican seats up, while many Democrats are not up. So as you can look in the map, this has a list of some of the safe toss-up leaning seats. And there's a risk that the control of the Senate could shift, which will impact a lot of day-to-day aspects as well as policy down the road, particularly depending on what happens in the House and the presidency. Here is a look at some of the competitive seats in the House. As you see, there's currently a very strong control by Republicans in the House. However, there's a lot of Republican seats up at risk. I'd say at this point, predictors do not think that the House will change control. However, there is a lot of concern by many members that there could be, or by many Republican members, that they could lose a number of seats. And then on the other hand, excitement by many Democratic members that think that they have a shot at gaining a little more closer to having an even House.
But the one thing to bear in mind as you're looking at all of these election slides is the polls will change. There's talk that a lot of the polls are wrong. If you look at the presidential, go to the Senate ones. If you look at the presidential numbers, and I was looking at them this morning, there's about 10 polls, all of which are literally all over the map, from 1 point to 12 points to 14 points to 3 points. So all of this will change. People will make mistakes. Races will pop up that are considered safe seats will, and vice versa. So this is a snapshot of today.
Yes, and so this is an interesting little chart right here. It shows the states that have historically voted one way or the other. However, with this election, there's a lot of prognosticators that think some of the old rules might not be relevant anymore. And so I think it's going to be an interesting next couple of months that will definitely impact what happens in Congress up to the election, and then, of course, impact it after.
And the reason this is important to USTOA is, I mean, part of the things that we are thinking about is what happens with the switch, new president one way or the other. What does it mean for the organization? What does it mean for priorities? You know, who is, you know, one of the things we always kid around about, at least in the Senate, when you're in the majority, all the people in the majority are really smart. And that continues no matter who's in the majority, because the minority party becomes less important in some respects. They're not any less smart, but everybody goes to the majority. So we have to figure out for you how this impacts the agenda, and that's part of why we've got these slides in there.
And generally, the state of Congress more broadly. As you know, for what is relevant to USTOA, there has been a significant administrative action on Cuba, and there's actually significant legislative debate occurring in Congress on that. We'll get a little bit deeper in that later on. Another key priority is the visa waiver program. Syrian civil war and concerns over ISIS have brought a lot of new scrutiny to the program, which we've been having to deal with over the past several months, and the scrutiny will likely continue, at least in the near term. Another issue is the House and Senate currently are standing off over FAA reauthorization. The current FAA reauthorization bill, which governs airline aviation policy, is set to expire this July 15th. And finally, as we all know, there's been significant recent attention in the chambers over TSA and screening lines. And then with the septennial, the national parks have also received an increased focus. We touched on this before, but the broader context, presidential election year, votes are highly politicized, particularly with the control of the Senate being potentially up for grabs. Every vote matters, and members are very conscientious about what they're signing their name onto. There's also a race to wrap up a congressional action by July 15th, at which point there'll be a bit of law in Congress, and then members will return for a potential lame duck session in November or December. To expand out a little more, here's a list of USTOA's key priorities: Cuba Travel and USTOA's open borders policy, the visa waiver program, the JOLT Act, national parks, hotel booking and other assorted taxes, travel infrastructure, and aviation consumer protection. As I mentioned, Cuba has been a big issue in recent months and years. There has been a lot of liberalization of the ability of Americans to engage in people-to-people travel to Cuba through now general licenses, as you know, which was a big win for USTOA. However, the embargo still exists, and it can only be eliminated through an act of Congress. To that end, there's been a number of pieces of legislation that seek to ease up travel and or the embargo to Cuba, which USTOA is supporting. This includes the Freedom to Travel to Cuba Act, the Freedom to Export to Cuba Act, the Cuba Trade Act, and the Cuba Agricultural Exports Act. And while we're in Congress next week, we want to urge members to support either some or all of these pieces of legislation. And depending on the member, maybe we'll want to urge them to join the Agriculture Act. Otherwise, maybe, for the travel tourism members that we meet with, we want them to join on the Travel to Cuba Act. However, we think that this is all one big issue, and if we can get a member of Congress interested in even a section of it, we think that it will help globally. Visa waiver program, this is something that's been in the news quite a bit. As many of you know, the EU has actually been making noise about reciprocal action against the U.S. on visa waiver program issues. We think that's not likely to happen. However, there's some scuffle and some posturing. We want to urge the U.S. Congress to be aware of that and to ensure that they know that the VWP is a major security and economic program. In addition to helping travelers travel to and from visa waiver program countries, it also allows us to coordinate law enforcement better, get pre-screening for potential travelers, and share information with our international partners. And that's a fact that is often overlooked in members of Congress, particularly after events happen. They often don't realize partly due to the name, they think it's a waiver program when it was really a security enhancing program. We want to stress that during our time next week. National parks. As you know, the national parks are a big tourism focus all across the country, and this year is its centennial. There has been significant action in both chambers on national parks funding and increasing it through the appropriations bills and the National Park Service Centennial Act. We want to encourage members to support that and put it on the floor and get it passed, and to ensure that there's robust appropriations down the road to make sure that our infrastructure of our parks does not crumble. Hotel and other taxes. This is an ongoing issue. Tourism is often an easy target for localities and municipalities to go after since it's taxing people that aren't there. We want to make sure Congress is aware of these issues and the impacts they have, and number one, encourage them to don't do any tourism targeted taxes, and to the extent possible to discourage our friends in the states and localities to ensure they aren't negatively impacting the country through very locally tailored provisions. Travel infrastructure, we touched on the FAA reauthorization, the ongoing debate. As you know, it expires mid-July. We want to encourage a quick and robust funding package, reauthorization package to provide our airports and aviation system enough money to keep travelers moving. Additionally, we were pleased about the recent highway reauthorization late last year that added travel and tourism as a factor for metropolitan planning. And finally, we want to urge a quick resolution to the TSA screening line issue. Congress has been pretty active so far, which we're pleased with, and it seems to be a bipartisan effort to provide TSA the flexibility and funding it needs. However, we need to keep the pressure on and try to make sure that happens sooner rather than later, particularly with the July 15th deadline coming up for Congress to be in session. And now I'll turn it over to Jonathan Folia, who has some updates on Department of Transportation.
Okay, thank you very much. Good day to everyone. So just this slide is starting off as we have with prior pre-caucus webinars to give you the latest on the pending rulemaking activity at DOT on fair transparency and enhancing passenger protections. By way of background, the department back in 2014 put out a very large proposed set of regulations that would, among other things, require the airlines to provide to ticket agents information on quote-unquote basic ancillary services. It would, prohibit the rulemaking would prohibit undisclosed display bias on electronic airline information systems. It would mandate that certain large ticket agents adopt and adhere to specific customer service standards. Covering refunds, holding cancellation without penalty of certain reservations, disclosures regarding carrier cancellation policies, aircraft seating configuration, and itinerary change notifications to consumers. And also, it should be added time limits for these large ticket agents to provide responses to written consumer complaints. The latest at this stage is that DOT is projecting late October 2016 for final rules. Having said that, DOT has to get the final rule package over to the White House Office of Management and Budget for coordination and review before it can actually publish the final rule. That currently is scheduled to occur next month in July, which leaves roughly a 3-month period for OMB to complete its review process in order for the DOT final rules to be issued. So there still is a distinct possibility that the final rule could be delayed further. One of the most controversial aspects of it, of course, is a proposal that would require the airlines to make their information on basic ancillary services available to GDS operators for downstream accessibility and distribution by authorized ticket agencies. Next slide, please. As the B team just covered, the Cuba travel issues are very much on the radar, not only at Congress, but also before DOT. DOT has, instituted the proceeding to, award scheduled traffic rights to U.S. airlines. This is a very, very highly contested proceeding. We had, 13 different U.S. airlines applying for scheduled traffic authority. The number of flights they, in the aggregate, have proposed to put into Havana far exceed the pool of frequency allocations that DOT can award under the agreement with Cuba. DOT can only, award 20 daily flights for service to Havana. We have almost 3 times that number of flights requested by U.S. airlines. So there will be a number of carriers that are not going to get their first, second, or third choice for sure. It's important to keep in mind as well that although services are authorized, scheduled services are permitted from any U.S. airport that has the federal inspection service facilities that CBP operates. Some of these airports in Cuba, the non-Havana airports, still have to be reviewed by the TSA to assess the adequacy of local civil aviation security. And so it's possible that DOT, when it makes its award of frequencies, there still has to be further action on the Cuban airport security side. And then finally, as many are fully aware on this call, when we talk about enhancing opportunities for meaningful cultural exchanges to occur with the Cuban people, as McBee pointed out, obviously, general tourism is not permitted, and the Treasury Department, specifically the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, they still require, businesses that are providing Cuba travel services to collect and retain travel certifications where the traveler essentially, attests to the general or specific license that authorizes their visit to Cuba. Next slide, please. And then finally, just a note on disability accommodations. As many will recall, DOT in 2011 proposed to require web accessibility for both airline websites as well as ticket agent websites. In 2013, DOT issued a final rule in which it decided not to move forward with accessibility for ticket agent websites, but it did enact a regulation at that time that requires most ticket agents to offer their web-only fares to telephone callers who identify as unable to use the website, the ticket agent's website, due to a disability. And one of the principal reasons why DOT decided not to move forward with web accessibility for ticket agent websites was because of the Department of Justice's rulemaking activity under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which covers places of public accommodation to include web information and services offered online by travel agencies. That rulemaking activity at the Department of Justice has been, I suppose, it's polite to frame it as deprioritized to a certain extent. It's been pushed back to 2018. The Department of Justice has decided to focus its efforts at this time on online information and services made available by state and local governments under Title II of the ADA. And then places of public accommodation, which include travel agencies, are covered under Title III of the ADA and will be dealt with subsequent to the state and local government web accessibility. So that could change, but the latest is that it has been pushed back to 2018. And with that, I'll turn it back over to McBee.
Thanks, Jonathan. And so just to summarize today, we wanted to present USTOA's key asks. These are the items that we are really pushing Congress for next week. As you know, co-sponsor the JOLT Act in the House and Senate, support continued reduction of travel barriers to Cuba, and sponsor any of the Cuba legislation. Additionally, oppose appropriations riders that would restrict travel, as there have been rumors and other potential amendments that have been floated around that might do so. Join the Travel and Tourism Caucus, oppose travel and tourism targeted taxes, ensure balanced and common sense regulations at the Department of Transportation, support H.R. 4680, the National Park Service Centennial Act, and other legislation that will support the National Park Centennial and future national park operations, and then ensure robust funding levels for TSA to ensure that the issue of long wait lines is solved. And with that, any questions or comments?
So I'd just like to open it up if any of our members have questions, or to reiterate, we will review this content again next week when we're together, and it will live on our website between now and then as well. And if I don't hear any questions, just a couple of housekeeping notes. First of all, to let you know that by the close of business this coming Monday, we will send to all of you the finalized agenda along with the bios of the offices that you will be meeting with. I will ask you to always be mindful that things are always fluid in the Beltway. So while we say it's a final agenda, we will always have 11th hour shifts in times and locations and things of that nature. But you will have that by the close of business on Monday. And then also just to remind you that we will meet in the lobby of the Washington Court Hotel at 5:15 on Wednesday, June 15th, so that we can get over to the opening reception at the University Club and then dinner later that night. So we thank you again. Your support is helping us accomplish one of our highest priorities, and that's to educate our elected officials in the Beltway. Let me also say a very huge and heartfelt thank you to McBee and Jonathan Folia for their continued guidance through this. We really appreciate their expertise. And if I don't hear any questions, then I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everyone. And with that, we will conclude the presentation.